For those of you who have not met, my name is Don Fitzpatrick. I serve as the chair of the Jefferson County Republican Party, and we appreciate you taking time on your busy schedules to be with us. I think we all know that public safety is something that's absolutely critical in our society and in our community in particular. Ironically, we had scheduled this event a month ago, and subsequent to that, there were the terrible shootings at Old National Bank, shootings at Chickasaw, one outside of the JCTC West Campus, Technical Campus, and we have an issue. And in fact, it's a series of issues that we need to step up to as a community. And what we'd like to do as a party is really nothing but a group of individuals that care, hopefully, those that engage and are involved in a number of different activities, is start to have a dialogue about how we can improve safety in this community. It is critical that we step up to this, and there's no easy answer, but there are a series of things that can be done that we wanted to begin again that discussion. Actually, last year, our speaker, Josh Crawford, was here along with Christopher 2X, and that spurred another couple of things that we were focused on throughout the year. But we wanted to re-engage and get the dialogue going again. And as I said, it was actually prior to some of the very, very tragic incidents recently that occurred in our wonderful city. So I would like to introduce Josh Crawford. He is our speaker this evening. And Josh, I will say that I've had the opportunity to listen to Josh a number of times. He makes tremendous sense and takes a lot of complex issues, boils them down, and helps us understand perhaps the path to solutions that we all know that we need to start to strive toward. Josh is the Director of Criminal Justice Initiatives with the Georgia Center for Opportunity, where he leads the public safety and reentry work. Josh has testified before local and state legislative committees and a presidential commission. His work can actually be found in the National Review, the Washington Examiner, and Chicago Sun-Times, as well as other publications across the country. Josh also serves as chairman of the board of Christopher 2X Game Changers, which, as most of you know, is an anti-violence nonprofit here in the city of Louisville. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Josh Crawford.
Well, Don, thank you, and thank you to the Jefferson County Republican Party for having me. I think the most effective way that I can start this conversation is to play a little bit of a video for you. I'll have some things to say, but I tend to find that these conversations are most valuable when they are in fact a conversation. And so if there are questions, if there are things you'd like to say, I want to give you all the opportunity to do that. And so we'll start this video and then we'll go from there.
Chris had more than one outlet.
Yeah, when he didn't draw, he would go in the garage and he would write a song. His music,
Play
his rap,
basketball. He was great at basketball. He was great at football. I mean, the man was like MVP of everywhere. He went to Job Corps and became prom king.
Yeah, he believed in uplifting whoever was in his circle. He was going to be the rapper and my oldest was going to be his accountant. He was going to make sure his contract looked right. And
Yeah,
his money
things like
was
that.
right.
He'd go over
so
everything.
he had it planned out all the way down to his sister was going to be back up on his songs. And he really had a purpose and he had a plan of what he was going to do with his life. He's taller than me. He's 6 feet. I'm 5'4". He came over to me and hugged me and gave me a little noogie on top of my head. And he said, "I love you too, ma'am. I'll see you later." I said, "Okay, 9:30. He said, "I know." And that was the last words that I said to my son.
He would have made his 10 o'clock curfew because he never disobeyed his 10 o'clock curfew, and he was 19 years old, and he never disobeyed the 10 o'clock
They
curfew.
pronounced my son dead at 10:10. My son got shot
9:20.
at 9:20. He was on his way home, and a car pulled around the corner and shot my son. He knew it, that we loved him, and that I'm grateful for, that I was able to tell him I love him.
He would
But
have
that
made,
shouldn't have been the last thing I've ever said to my son.
The thing that's really, I think, affected especially the families and neighbors and citizens that I'm connected to on a daily basis. It's got to be the public health crisis in regards to violent crime issues. It's not pretty. Violence is an ugly, ugly situation, and it's getting worse, and I've got to be frank about that over the last 6 years and some change, the uptick in violence has just went on a trajectory that I wouldn't have never imagined 10 years ago, 12, 13, 14, 15 years ago.
There is no one who wants the violence to stop more than the people who live in these neighborhoods who aren't committing the violence. In any given city, it's typically about 0.5% of your population that's responsible for more than 50% of your violence. We're talking about an overwhelming critical mass of folks who are basically held hostage by a very small number of folks who make life a living hell for them.
Violence is touching people who want nothing to do with this life. Nothing to do with it. And they're getting hurt, and sometimes they get labeled unfairly as being a part of the culture of this perpetuating the violence. Not so true all the time.
I think about the Gwynn family all the time. Just before Christmas 2019, their son is gunned down because of the neighborhood that he lives in. And just a few weeks ago here in 2021, their daughter is shot in the leg and will have a metal rod in her leg for the rest of her life because she was hanging out in a city park.
First she texts me, she says, "Mama." And I said, "What?" I text back and I said, "What?" Then she texts me her location. "Get here. I just got shot." What? I remember when I finally stopped my car, my brakes was smoking. It was smoking. I got out the car and proceeded to run towards her. I seen her face and she was like, "Mom, I'm okay. I'm okay. Meet me at the hospital." So I went in and seen her, and as soon as I walked in the door, I couldn't do nothing but cry and just hold her. Because the thought of almost losing another child, I think I'd have lost my mind. What left of it. I have 4 children, and 2 of my 4 have been shot, 1 has been killed. How a small family like that succumbed to something so tragically. My daughter said when them people came to the park and shot up the park, she said, "Mom, I felt like I was in a Call of Duty game."
Yeah.
She said, "I can hear the bullets
Ricocheting
whizzing
off the gate, whizzing high
past
head,
me."
bouncing off the ground.
She said, "Mom, it sounded like it
hitting
was
houses.
going phew, phew,
It's
phew,
real
phew.
loud. It's real loud.
She said, "At first I thought it was fireworks." She said, "Then I started hearing them go past me." She said, "I felt like I was in a Call of Duty game."
200 rounds.
And she said that echoes in her head all the time.
If you say you care about children, why would you want to allow any part of your city to be subjected to this kind of horrific and devastating effects of what violent crime does to kids? Kids who are just looking for a chance early on to see what life's gonna be like. And to see how life shapes out for them, but these distractions knock them off their learning curve, tear their focus apart, and totally puts them into, again, non-verbalizing ways and worlds where they can't even talk about what violence is doing to them, but we can easily observe the trauma effects on them.
My daughter hangs with her friend. Her friend literally lives 2 blocks
Down the street.
and I drive her. She has a hoverboard, she has a bike, she has skates. She don't use them. Her bike got dust on it. Her hoverboard is not charged. Her skates is in her room.
They don't want to go outside, and it's
I
just
drive
like
them.
you can do whatever you can around this neighborhood, make beautiful streets, build the parks up. It's just the gun violence is so prevalent here in this city. It's just that these kids are just scared to be by themselves.
So now we're out here fighting for all the other Christians. Female, male, these kids deserve an opportunity to live and to grow. They're out here trying to make something of themselves. They out here trying to graduate high school or show their parents they gonna be something in life, and they being gunned down, and it's just senseless.
My individual research expertise is in urban violence and in studying urban violence and in crafting policies to try to mitigate urban violence. We know what works. We know what works here. Anybody who actually studies the technical literature knows what works. It's about putting it together in a package that is palatable to policymakers and getting those policymakers to do it. And I think that we've been able to do that, to actually understand the technical research, to package it in a way that's palatable to policymakers, and then to push policymakers to actually do the right thing.
It's an ongoing fight. It is not a one-day fight or a one-year fight. This is ongoing. And, you know, we understand that, and my son is worth that fight. He's definitely worth that fight.
There are two names that you didn't see pictures of or stories told in that video that I want to talk to you about briefly. First is a young man by the name Tyrese Garvin, who in July of 2019 left U of L Hospital after the birth of his twins. And he was walking home from U of L Hospital when 3 juveniles pulled up and killed him, or shot him, I should say. He had no beefs in the streets. He was truly a person who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was transported then back to U of L Hospital, and several days later, his newborn twins were placed in a bed next to him because he was going to be taken off life support. Those children will grow up without a father, having never known their father. He only got to hold those twins one time after they were born. And then he died in the hospital just a few rooms away from where his girlfriend was recovering from delivering those children. A little over a year later, Trinity Randolph was in her home, 3-year-old girl here in the city of Louisville. She was murdered, as was her father. And when police arrived on the scene, because of the chaos in the surrounding area, one of the officers that was on the scene began to perform CPR and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. But 3-year-old Trinity succumbed to her injuries and died. She was buried shortly thereafter in a Disney coffin. And so, while events like last Monday get a lot of attention and are truly tragic in their own right, that's not the average interaction with violent crime, and especially homicide, that takes place in our city. And so as we think about this as a policy question, and as we think about how to make Louisville a safer city, preventing events like last Monday are critically important. But many of you may have seen the press conference that the doctor from U of L Health has done, where he said for them it did not require a particular increase or reallocation of resources on Monday, that they have become accustomed to dealing with that sort of influx, and it's a tragic commentary on the state of the city. So, as was previously mentioned, my name is Josh Crawford. I am the Director of Criminal Justice Initiatives at the Center for Opportunity. I want to take a moment to thank all of you for being here. It is a little bit after 6 o'clock on a Thursday, and you are here to listen to and talk about just about the worst thing that a human being can do to another human being. You could be anywhere this evening. You could be having a nice dinner. You could be talking about something far more pleasant. And it is a commentary on your commitment to this city and your commitment to those who are less fortunate than you all, that you have chosen to be here this evening. And so I truly appreciate it. When I was first asked to do this, and this has been alluded to already, it was not only before the events of last Monday, but the tenor of that talk was going to be almost exclusively positive. We had just gotten some data back, and in the first 3 months of the year, homicides were down 13%, and non-fatal shootings were down 13%. And while that's insufficient, it's progress. It's things headed in the right direction. But unfortunately, April has been a particularly bad month so far for the city of Louisville. We had 18 murders in the first 16 days of April. We have had more than 50 people murdered in this city so far this year. And so it would be a mistake to stand up here and talk about the first quarter of the year or just talk about the month of April so far, because those are snapshots of where the city is, perhaps where the city is going. But I want you to remember that 50 homicides for the year so far number, because it's an important one. So as we zoom out on the city of Louisville, what we find is that from 1980 until 2014, so 35-year period, 35-year period, this city averaged just over 55 homicides a year. That's not great, right? That's 55 friends, brothers, people who sit down the pew from you at church, people you see at the grocery store, people you see at a restaurant, friends, neighbors, brothers, sisters, and so forth. But for a city our size, 55 homicides a year meant we were pretty safe. And then things changed. From 2015 through 2022, we have averaged 124 homicides a year. So you're talking about more than 150% increase in that time period. And you're talking about going from averaging 55 homicides a year to, through the first month or 3.5 months of the year, being at nearly that number. It's unacceptable. We didn't get here overnight, and we won't get back from here overnight. But it's important to understand where we've been and where we are now. All 3 of our deadliest years ever have been since 2016. 2016 was our deadliest year ever. Excuse me, that used to be correct. All 4 of our deadliest years ever have all been since 2016. 2020, 2021, and 2022 are our top 3, and 2016 is number 4. So, why does this matter? The first reason seems relatively obvious to me. You're talking about the unlawful, unjustified taking of human life. Again, you're talking about just about the worst thing that a human being can do to another human being. And we should want less of that. That seems pretty straightforward. The second reason, though, is not quite as straightforward, but in a lot of ways matters just as much. Cities become far less vibrant, far more impoverished, and this is especially true at the individual neighborhood level, when violent crime increases. People get the relationship between poverty and violent crime almost perfectly backwards. What you will very frequently hear people say is if you solve poverty, then you solve violent crime. Setting aside for the moment the incredible and complex difficulty of solving a question like poverty that we had declared war on generations ago and still not gotten to a place where it's eradicated in our country. If you set that aside, what we find is that poverty is actually not a particularly good indicator of violent crime. And that's because the overwhelming majority of people who grow up poor will never pick up a gun and shoot someone. And that's true for virtually every so-called root cause that you can pick. And pick the root cause of your political persuasion. Regardless of what you think the underlying cause is, what we find is that most people who find themselves in that circumstance will still never pick up a gun, point it at somebody, and shoot. What we do find, though, is that once a poor community becomes a violent community, it stays poor much longer. Private sector job growth falls off a cliff. The economic mobility of the bottom quartile, so your poorest residents, falls off a cliff. People get trapped in that poverty because there's fewer opportunities. It becomes far more difficult to leave. It becomes far more difficult to have confidence when you're sending your kids to school, as they walk to the bus stop. And if when you look in the cupboard there's no bread, or you look in the refrigerator and there's no milk, but you don't feel safe in your community and the sun has gone down, you are far more likely to wait till the next day to go get those things than to leave your home. and trudge out in a neighborhood that you don't feel safe in. And so, when we talk about economic development, when we talk about upward mobility, when we talk about opportunities for the most vulnerable, the very first thing that we must do is ensure that the neighborhood is safe, not the last thing. Safety is not the consequence of other policy decisions. It is and of itself a policy decision. And for far too often, safe streets have been treated like a luxury. It's something you get if you live in an affluent part of a community, but something you don't get if you don't live in those parts of the communities. That's unacceptable, and it need not be this way. For as long as there have been cities, there has been violence in cities. And so one of the really encouraging things is that we have pretty good data on what works and what doesn't work. Some of those things are going on here in Louisville. Some of those things need to be done better here in Louisville. Some of those things need to be in partnerships with our state government. And Representative Hodgson, who is here, the Louisville delegation overall in Frankfurt has done a wonderful job in recent years of making the safety of Louisville residents a priority. Just this last session, House Bill 3, which addressed a number of things having to do with violent juvenile offenders, as well as trying to get to folks earlier, especially truant youth who were not improving in diversion programs, did a tremendous number of things to try to help Louisville out. The current administration, the Greenberg administration, whether you voted for the gentleman or not, has taken steps to try to improve the public safety of this city. Now, he inherited what is arguably the worst public safety situation in the city. There are very few cities that trended in the direction negatively further than we did in the years preceding his time. There's arguably not a city where things were as bad internally as the circumstance that he inherited. And so while Mayor Greenberg and I disagree on a great number of things, I have been very pleased by some of the decisions that have been made by his administration. And if they continue, hopefully will continue to improve public safety here in the city. So that's part of what is going on currently. What obviously looms for the city is a federal consent decree for LMPD. There was an analysis done by the news agency Axios, which is certainly in no way a sort of right-wing propaganda machine, that found that cities, after entering into this consent decree, far more often than not see substantial increases in homicides and other types of violence. That doesn't guarantee that that's where we will be, but what it does mean is that the public safety apparatus of this city, the public safety apparatus of this state, needs to be aware of the potential for things to get worse before they get better because of that consent decree. My hope is that we have learned in the intervening years how to do those in a way that doesn't have that implication, but that is a hope, not a guarantee on my part.
What does the data say is the reason for that? I mean, I think there's conjecture, but what does the data say? Is the
Sure.
reason for that?
So one of the really strong indications of a city's trend in homicides one way or the other is its relationship with what's referred to as self-initiated police activity. So self-initiated police activity is basically everything that law enforcement does that's not a response to a call for service. And so that's things like motor vehicle and street stops, but it's also things like checks on businesses, checks on abandoned buildings, what is broadly thought of as community policing, that kind of stuff. What some analyses have found is that that self-initiated police activity is reduced substantially as a part of the consent decree. And so basically when you have officers who are less engaged, broadly speaking, that it tends to increase serious violence, including homicides.
Is that a they're not allowed to, or a they're not motivated to?
I would say it's a little bit of both, right? That it is first a response to a policy that says you can or cannot do that, and then there's a general morale question as it relates to what is the message behind that policy, right? Here's the black letter law of what you can and can't do, but if the value of the department is that we want less of this, broadly speaking, then am I going to be motivated to put myself out there to do whatever that thing is? And so I do think it's a little bit of both.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And so that is certainly looming for the city. How that is handled by the administration, by the police department, by the Department of Justice, and by the monitors will probably have major implications for the city. There's a couple of things that the city can do to continue to improve where we have been. One of the things that has gotten a lot of attention recently, especially in the wake of the shootings in Chickasaw, is that there are insufficient protections locally for witnesses. The Federal Witness Protection Program has existed for a long time. It has sort of very specific goals. But one of the things that you find in communities that are plagued by a high rate of violence is that the offenders are more omnipresent than the protection is, right? And so there is a fear associated with that. And if you can eliminate that fear by creating some sort of protective service for individuals who have witnessed violent crimes, then you get better cooperation, you get better homicide clearance rates, and when you get better homicide clearance rates, then there's more confidence in law enforcement generally. There's a better perception of safety in the neighborhood. And so one of the things that has gotten a lot of attention is, in some cases, the creation of a local effort here in Louisville, or the re-examination of an effort that already exists at the state level. The state put about $200,000 into a state-level witness protection program a number of years ago. That has not been spent down in its entirety. It's my understanding that is a very difficult process to navigate, that prosecutors have a terrible time of trying to navigate that system, and so those resources are not being expended the way that they need to. And so a reevaluation and a reimagining of that at the state level, I think, would be really positive for the city. Another thing is something that was floated by current Attorney General Daniel Cameron and candidate for governor in our recent podcast, where he talked about putting a state police precinct in Jefferson County. For far too long, the state has sort of washed its hands of Jefferson County as it relates to public safety questions. The Kentucky State Police are not the Kentucky State, or not the rural Kentucky State Police. They are not the state police of 118 counties. They are not the state police of 119 counties. They are the Kentucky State Police. And so having the state police have a more collaborative role here could be really positive for the city. It gives the state some skin in the game in the city of Louisville. Doesn't allow the state to merely say, oh, that's not our problem, that's Louisville's problem, we'll let them deal with it. And it's something that takes place all over the country. The example I always use is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Certainly no state that has a particular interest in coming down hard on blue cities, right? But the Massachusetts State Police have a working and permanent relationship with the Boston Police Department as it relates to anti-violent crime efforts, and they're partners just like our federal partners are. Unfortunately, under current circumstances, LMPD has better working relationships with federal partners than it does with state partners. It ought not be that way. It doesn't need to be that way. The same is true of the Department of Corrections. The Department of Corrections to this juncture has been an impediment to getting group violence intervention operating the way that it needs to. They don't need to be that impediment. They should be a valuable partner, and there are other ways that the State Department of Corrections can be a valuable partner. And so the state ought to play a bigger role here, not because there needs to be some sort of war on Louisville, but because Jefferson County, contrary to what some people out in the rest of the state think, and contrary to what many people in Jefferson County think, is a part of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And so it is the responsibility of the Commonwealth that the people of Jefferson County are safe, and we ought to be deliberate about how we do that. The final thing I'll talk about is something that people in this room have heard me talk about. I talked about the last time I did one of these, which is group violence intervention. Group violence intervention strategies focus on the drivers of violence. You heard me in that video talk about it's typically about 0.5% of your population that's responsible for about 50% of your violence, 50 to 70% of your shootings and homicides in particular. The percentage of the population that's participating in things like carjacking and armed robberies is also very, very small. There is not a community in the United States that is a high crime community. What I mean by that is that there is not a community in the United States in which a majority of its residents are participating in violent crime. Violent crime is perpetuated all over the country by a very small number of people. And in our most vulnerable communities, those communities are being held hostage by a very small number of people. It doesn't need to be this way. The Greenberg administration has done a number of really positive things to try to move GVI forward. It was sort of slow-walked by the previous administration on a number of fronts. But we still have that impediment of the Department of Corrections, the Department of Probation and Parole specifically, and it is my hope that will be resolved in the near term, but there's no guarantees there. And so that's sort of where we are. That's sort of how we got here and what's going on. But what I really want to do is respond to the questions of the group. What are you all thinking about? What makes you feel more or less safe? And so I want to have a conversation about those things. But thank you all again for being here. Adam.
You actually, so you mentioned it again, and so I apologize, I phrased it poorly, but not throwing anybody under the bus, what specifically is DOC and probation and parole doing that's making it harder?
Yeah.
Like what should we advocate for changes?
Yeah, I see you have a notepad, and anybody who wants an answer to this question may want to take out a notepad. It's a very technical question, very technical answer.
We just have Adam's phone number.
Which is this. So group violence intervention, the primary function of that is what's referred to as a call-in. And at these call-ins, they bring in identified shooters and gang members, they sit them down, and 2 simultaneous messages are delivered. The first is an enforcement message. We know who you are, we know what you're up to, and the shooting stopped today. Here's what happens if they don't stop. We're coming after the whole group, we're coming down hard, we're coming down heavy, we will arrest the whole cohort, et cetera, if the shootings and the violence stop. And that's the only ask. We don't expect these young men to be choir boys the next day. We don't necessarily expect them to have jobs the next day. But the thing that must stop is the shooting. So that's the first message. The second message is a social service message. You need a driver's license? We can get you a driver's license. You're out pumping dope on the street because you're paying your mom's rent? Pay your mom's rent for a month. You need diapers for a baby? We'll get you diapers for a baby. It's a bunch of what's referred to as the big small stuff. The stuff that seems unconsequential, the stuff that seems not that big of a deal, but when you're living on the margins can be a really big deal and can be the difference between being motivated to be in the street and not. There are longer term things for people who want them, job training, stuff like that as well. But these are really the cornerstone of GVI. The way you get people there is that you leverage probation and parole status. So you say you're a probationer, you're a parolee, you have to come to this meeting. This is going to be your meeting with your P&P officer. Well, the Kentucky Department of Corrections has taken the position that they cannot order probationers and parolees to come to these meetings. Somebody asked the question, how many other states have experienced this? Somebody asked the question.
How many other states have experienced this?
0. They're doing this in multiple countries. Somebody asked the question, how many other countries are experiencing this?
How many other countries?
0. We are a complete outlier because of an interpretation of a state Supreme Court decision that I believe is legally erroneous, that many of the elected attorneys in the city of Louisville believe is erroneous, but is the Department of Corrections position. And so we have not been able to get as many people into these call-ins, nearly as many people into these call-ins as need to be there. Now,
Why is that the interpretation of the Department of Corrections?
I would hesitate to put myself in the shoes of this Department of Corrections. But I think that there is just a desire to not be as active a participant as they could be. Why that is, there are people more well-versed in perhaps the politics of that than me who could.
Was that the case with the previous governor?
So this was not operating during the Biden administration, so we don't have a comparison there. But they have not, unfortunately, participated the way that we would like them to, that we think is appropriate. And so there have been a number of workarounds that have been put in place. Tom Lyon's office is now getting attendance as a condition of probation in relevant cases, but that's a sort of slow but sure process. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, well, start from the top down. How does that, it's not a law, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, well, who put that there and how do you change it? Can the governor change it?
So it depends, right? I think the honest answer to that question is yes, because it is a interpretation of a court decision about a regulation. And so there are contrary interpretations of that court decision, and that regulation that would suggest that there's no reason that you could not compel these individuals to be there. And so the Department of Corrections could say that we don't think that this interpretation is correct, because it's all internal. It's an internal interpretation of those things. So it's not like a judge has said to them, you can't participate. It's not as if the state Supreme Court has said that they can't participate. It is an internal decision within the Department of Corrections.
But can the governor change it?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, if you assume that the buck ultimately starts
Might
with
as
the
well
governor.
start at the top instead of go from the bottom up
Correct.
and just address it to the governor.
Right. The governor could change it, the secretary could change it, the commissioner could change it, so on and so forth.
Who's the director of that department, and is that elected or appointed official?
So Kerry Harvey is the Justice and Public Safety Secretary.
So they're the ones that have led this policy that you just described?
Cookie Cruz is the commissioner of the Department of Corrections, and so depending on where on the spectrum you want to stop, there are multiple people.
Are they state employees or appointed?
Secretary Harvey is appointed. I'm not sure if the Corrections Commissioner is appointed or if that's a merit position. It's appointed.
These are all governor's people.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, if I could, another question.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that Mayor Greenberg's done some good things. Could
Yeah.
you share with us what those would be? What
Sure.
you call
Yeah.
productive,
So.
constructive?
Yeah, so group violence intervention was really an effort that was initiated by former U.S. Attorney Russell Coleman, but obviously has to largely be administered by city officials. The Fisher administration sort of got things up and running, but never operated it in a way that I think would be consistent with best practices in that space. What the Greenberg administration has done is the first thing that came in is there used to be just one individual from LMPD who was not a particularly high-ranking individual who would be a part of our governance committee calls. There are now 3 individuals, including a major who has decision-making authority. So one of the problems was if this individual came back from a governance meeting and said, hey, we need to do this thing. Well, he needed to get permission from somebody, who got permission from somebody, who got permission from somebody to do whatever that thing was. Now that's not the case. All the relevant players are in those meetings so that if something needs to happen, then they can make that decision. As a part of that meeting, we can go on and go forward. So that is positive. They have really stepped up collaboration with federal partners that had waned some during the end of the previous administration. One of the things that is beneficial to the federal partners is federal mandatory minimums for certain serious and violent felonies, and especially felonies committed with a gun. Federal judges don't play around the way some local judges do, and so the leverage point there as it relates to federal partnerships is really important. Those have improved some, and they've just done a far better job of coordinating, and Deputy Mayor James, who sort of oversees all public safety questions, has been very committed to making sure that this operates the way that it's supposed to. And so all of that has been really positive, and I really can't complain about the way they have handled that program in particular.
Is the parole the only way to get people to those meetings, or are there other mechanisms? If we know who those people are, as you said, are there other ways to go to them?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways, some that are more effective than others. The least effective way is politely asking them. That is some of what has gone on to this juncture. And some people are sort of looking for a way out, right? And so if you give them the opportunity, they will be there. Part of the problem, even for those who want the way out, though, is they're kind of skeptical of this very law enforcement heavy meeting that I'm going to avail myself to, right? So that's a pretty ineffective way of doing it. The second way is what Commonwealth Attorney Lyon's office is doing now, which is to get attendance as a specified condition of all future probation cases for relevant individuals, so that it's no longer a question of interpretation. It is directly a part of your conditions of probation, so you have to go there. That is a far more effective way, but it's slow and it's going to take some time, right? Because it's only cases moving forward. They can't retroactively do any of that. And so those are sort of the 2 other ways that have been approached with moderate success, depending on the sort of standard you're applying. Yes, sir.
2 questions. Any gun control measures would help or not? Second, frisk or stop and frisk measures, do they help or not? I think they did in New York at one time.
Yeah, so I'll answer your second question first, which is that stop and frisk is a tool like any other law enforcement tool. And so it can be used effectively, it can be used ineffectively. One of the mistakes that New York City made is that they began to incorporate stop and frisk into the CompStat system. So so CompStat is their data collection. And so what they did was they started to count stop and frisk events as goals to be met, sort of de facto quotas, right? And the idea there was that you're encouraging more frisks, you'll recover more illegal guns, and so on and so forth. What ended up happening is that they ended up having more frisks, and a smaller and smaller percentage of the frisks that they did would recover guns. So they were casting a wider net, but they weren't catching more fish. And so that led to some of the constitutional concerns about the way that stop and frisk was being done, because now it's sort of a quota, it's a metric, there's a specified number you're trying to meet, whether or not you have that many particular individuals that ought to meet the requirements for a Terry stop at a given time. And so you can do stop and frisk in a way that is an effective crime-fighting tool, and New York did so for a very long time, but it is a risky tool depending on how you use it. The second one is it sort of depends on what you mean by gun control. I loathe the term gun violence. And I loathe the term gun violence because when people say gun violence, they're really talking about four separate and distinct things. The first thing that they're talking about is street crime, street violence, right? Typically violence with some sort of underlying felony, be it a robbery, drug dealing, gang activity, so on and so forth. The second thing that they're talking about is domestic violence. Well, the causes and the consequences and the solutions for domestic violence are fundamentally different from what they are for street crime. The third thing that they're talking about is firearms-related suicides. Firearms is a particularly lethal form of suicide and accounts for, in most years, about twice as many deaths as it relates to firearms as do homicides. The final thing that they're talking about is mass public shootings. And that terminology is important because mass shootings are different from mass public shootings. In about 88% of instances, what is deemed a mass shooting either has an underlying felony that is occurring, again, drug dealing, armed robbery, gang violence, and so really is a street violence question, or is a domestic instance in which an individual kills their spouse and family. It meets the definition for a mass shooting, but is not a mass public shooting. So that's sort of 12% of all mass shootings that are what occurred last Monday, what happens in schools tragically and things like that. Mass public shootings, separate and distinct. When you're talking about street violence, there are a number of things related to firearms that might be important, might be effective. Recognizing this, that about 80 to 85% of street violence incidents involve a firearm. The individual is either not a lawful possessor of that firearm, would be precluded from possessing that firearm because they're a convicted felon or something like that, or the firearm itself is unlawful. It's an automatic weapon, and unless you have a special federal license, you couldn't possess it even if you wanted to, right? So what can be done to stem the tide of lawfully purchased weapons into the black market that get them into the hands of street criminals? One of the things that has been looked at is sort of state-level fraudulent purchase laws, state-level straw purchase laws. Currently, the federal system has that available to it. If you've looked at the data at all on this, though, you'll know that those prosecutions vary wildly by administration. And so if an administration is taking violent crime seriously, then you see those percentage of prosecutions go up. If an administration is not taking violent crime as seriously, those prosecutions go down. But as it relates to the city of Louisville, the only way that those prosecutions can take place right now is if a federal partner takes it. And so a number of states, including red states, have crafted laws to try to do that. They don't take away any lawful possessor's firearm, but they try to do things that if you are trying to fraudulently acquire that firearm, or you are acquiring that firearm for the purpose of giving it to somebody that you happen to know is unlawfully in possession of that firearm, that those things can help stem that tide some. The truth of the matter, though, is that a wide array of the weapons that end up on the black market are the result of home burglaries and thefts. That people break into homes, steal firearms, and they end up on the black market that way. And so when you're talking about street violence in particular, there are not a wide array of sort of gun control measures that are impactful. We have better data on what some of those policies would do potentially for firearms-related suicides. What we don't know, at least I'm unfamiliar with,
because I don't really specialize in firearms-related suicide, is if they reduce suicide overall, or if they just reduce suicide as it relates to firearms. I just don't know the data that well. And so there are some things as it relates to guns, especially trying to keep guns out of the hands of people who are legally barred from possessing them in the first place, that might be helpful. But there is not, to use a really bad pun for the topic, a silver bullet as it relates to those things for that. John?
There's been a recent push for destroying the firearms that are confiscated during crime. Does that have any impact, or is that just an emotional issue?
Yeah, so there's not a great indication in the data that those firearms are any more likely to end up on the street than the sale of any other particular firearm, or that there is any particular market for those kind of firearms that is different from the other legal firearms purchasing market. I do think Kentucky is unique in the way that we handle those confiscated firearms. Most states either destroy those firearms or use them for firearm safety trainings and things like that, as opposed to selling them back on the market. And I do think for certainly victims of violent crime, there is a uncomfortableness with the idea that the firearm that was used to kill your loved one is back in circulation, or that it may have some particular value because it was used that way. And so in that sense, I'm very sympathetic to the position, but there's no data at this point that those firearms are uniquely likely to end up back on the street.
Although Mayor Greenberg repeatedly has those media events with the props of the confiscated weapons and claims that in fact is contributing to street crime here in Louisville. So there's no data that supports that assertion.
That they are any different than any other lawfully acquired firearm.
Because they are sold back legally by federal firearms dealers that are operating in a retail.
Correct. And so those guns may end up back on the street, just like a gun that was bought at a pawn shop or a firearms dealership. But they're correct. But there's nothing about those firearms uniquely ending back up on the street.
Of course, you don't have to answer this, but I wonder why the media has not challenged him on that, but it's outside the scope of your discussion.
Yeah.
Is there anything that would prevent a private entity, it's a nonprofit, from going to those firearms auctions, buying the guns and destroying them?
Not that I am aware of. I don't know that statute well enough to know for sure, but not that I'm aware of. Brian?
Couple of questions. I'm interested in your thoughts on the level of policing. I'd seen some data that the United States has a lot lower level of policing than, say, some European countries, and sort of your thoughts on how short are we really in Louisville? And then second, are there some other things that the Kentucky General Assembly ought to be doing to sort of help set Louisville on the right path? And I'm looking at Missouri, who literally is so fed up with what's going on in St. Louis that they're giving the governor the ability to appoint a special prosecutor. They're giving the governor some appointment power over the police board there in St. Louis to try to gain control. Are there some things that we can ask our friend John over here to advocate for?
Yeah. Second question first again. There absolutely are. I think that the state needs to have more of a presence and more of a collaborative presence in Louisville. The difference between Kentucky and Louisville and Missouri and St. Louis or Georgia and Atlanta is that there is a hostility towards enforcing the law in the two latter jurisdictions that I don't think exists here in Louisville. Tom Wine is not a progressive prosecutor by any stretch of the imagination. His folks are understaffed and all those kinds of things, so there are those practical limitations, but there is not an ideological limitation as it relates to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office here. I do think that the state police need to be more involved in fighting crime in Louisville. Now, in order to do that successfully, we need to increase the size of KSP. Because if all that was done is that we took 35 troopers from policing the rural parts of the state and put them in Louisville, all that's going to do is put a trooper further away from a problem in the rural part of the state, right? And so it's going to require that we overall increase the size of KSP. One of the things that has been floated a number of times is to give wiretap authority to either the larger police departments or just KSP, and that KSP in partnership with local departments could utilize some of that the way that our federal partners do currently. That doesn't exist anywhere in the Commonwealth. There's no agency that has that ability. I think that there's potential
value to that, again, assuming there's appropriate constitutional limitations, those kinds of things. And so that is certainly part of it. We don't collect data in the state the way that we need to, and that's one of the things that now working in a number of other states that I have found, right? When I pull the same data from Kentucky and from Georgia, the robustness of the data in Georgia it's night and day, right? Like everything is de-identified, but I know how well educated those people were, how many, like what percentage of the year they spent employed upon release, their gang affiliation, their risk assessment score, all that kind of stuff. You pull the Kentucky data and it's like, here's some broad demographic data and here's whether they recidivated or not. And so we can make better informed decisions when we have better data on who and what the problems are. And the benefit to that Georgia data is that what we're finding is that what we thought was correct from the technical literature is accurate for Georgia, and so that we can do the appropriate things there. But I think having the state police be better partners and having the Department of Corrections be better partners. One of the things that's often overlooked is that the Department of Corrections oftentimes has better understanding on individual relationships and associations than even local police departments do. Because a local police department may not have somebody as a verified gang member, but the Department of Corrections may know that for the 2.5 years that guy was in state prison, he was hanging out with all these guys that are EST or O Block or whatever, right? And so all of a sudden, this guy who wasn't a person of interest in OPD is now, because the Department of Corrections can say those things. And again, this is stuff that goes on in other states, goes on in red states, goes on in blue states. And so that is definitely stuff that can be valuable. What was your first question again?
Level of policing.
Yes.
Versus other countries.
Yeah, what we know is broadly true is that more police means less crime, right? That to the extent that there is an academic consensus on anything, there's a pretty broad academic consensus for the proposition that more police equals less crime. What those officers are doing matters even more, and so effective strategy and things like that matters quite a bit. We are living through sort of an era of depolicing in the United States, and there are two reasons for that. One is ideological and on purpose, and the other is people leaving the profession and the consequences of the first, right? LMPD is down more than 300 officers. When LMPD is fully staffed, what that basically means is that they can police the city fully if no one has called in sick, no one's on vacation. So like our fully staffed number is really sort of like our bare minimum number. And so we are about 300 officers below that, plus vacations, sick days, all that kind of stuff.
What percentage is that?
The 300?
Yeah, roughly.
I don't know offhand, but I can find out to be sure. But again, that's not something that is unique to Louisville. But what we are seeing is the standard trajectory for officers for a number of years has been you police in the big city for a period of time, then you go police in the suburbs, the pay is better, the job is less difficult, all that kind of stuff. What you are seeing now is a lot of early retirements, a lot of guys who are leaving the profession altogether, and we're having a real recruitment problem because you have sort of like police families where somebody is saying to a child, go do something else, you know, go to school and do this, go into a trade and do that, go be a firefighter. I don't know if any police families are saying that, but you know, are discouraging, again, when like dad was a police officer, grandpa was a police officer, that kind of stuff, who are discouraging their children from going into law enforcement. And the consequences of that are that the community overall becomes less safe, but especially our most vulnerable communities become less safe.
State police have the same problem though, don't they?
So state police were for a long time the most poorly paid police department in the state, despite having very difficult jobs, despite oftentimes being 30 minutes without backup in a very rural part of the state. And so there was quite a bit of attrition there. The General Assembly has done a number of things to try to correct that as it relates to the pay question. They have been able to improve the recruitment and retention numbers. The question is if they can make that sustainable over the long term. And so there certainly needs to be more work done there. But I think when you're talking about the state police, you're just talking about a larger pool of individuals than you are when you're talking about sort of the City of Louisville Police Department. John, and then Grandmaster.
Back before city-county merger, 20 years ago, rural Jefferson County outside of Gene Snyder to the east and to the south was really, like I said, the Jefferson County Sheriff, it wasn't part of Metro PD. Seemed like it would make a lot of sense for KSP to come in and extend their Shelby County, Blount County, Spencer County patrols into the rural parts of the county outside of Snyder, because I think we've got something like 250,000 people outside that boundary patrolled by 8 LMPD officers.
Yeah.
It really extends them geographically, but the terrain is a lot more like the other 119 counties because it's windy roads, acreage, horses and cows and things like that.
Yeah, I think if I were the person putting this all together, my recommendation would be that sort of KSP assumes some sort of like standard policing duties in the areas that you're talking about, and that they specialize in partnerships and collaborations as it relates to gangs, groups, narcotics, things like that, and in sort of the rest of the city. That you don't necessarily need a KSP trooper driving down Main Street and patrolling, but that there are specific resources that the state can provide as it relates to some of those tasks.
Patrol standards are very different than.
That's certainly true.
How can we as citizens help? How can we hold ourselves accountable?
Yeah.
Instead of waiting for the troops to come forth?
Yeah.
What can we do to help?
Yeah, I think
if I might, I want to clarify, or just Grandmaster, by the way, my mom always said, don't ever interrupt a Grandmaster, especially if he's a 10th degree black belt. But I am going to, because what Grandmaster Khalid Rahim is doing with the Arabian Nights Martial Arts Academy is the best example I can think of, teaching kids discipline, teaching them self-respect, and also teaching them ways to protect themselves without having to pull something out. And so we've been very pleased to support his organization. We will continue to do that big tournament this summer, whatever, but really most importantly, just learning from what he's been doing with the kids. And I can tell you, having been down at the dojo a number of times, how many of them stop in to see the Grandmaster for a hug, or just for someone to listen to them. And because in many ways, you are mom and dad for some of these kids. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I really thought it was important that people understood, and Josh may have done that as well prior to me jumping in here, but in any event, we're going to search as a party. This is where I will say something about the party. We are going to continue to support folks that are doing great things that just aren't well known in the city, and we're going to support you in multiple ways. So pardon my interruption again, 10th degree black belt. I'm not a very bright guy, but
No, I'm glad you did that, because the answer is the standard 3 T's, right? It's time, talent, treasure. We all have the opportunity to give back in some way. In some cases, that's going to be of our time. Mentoring, spending time with kids, especially young men who come from suboptimal circumstances, especially circumstances without a father, right? It takes a man to teach a boy how to be a man, right? If you've got the time to do it, you ought to be doing it. If you've got talent because you own a business where a pipeline of young people who may have some gumption and some interest can be helpful to you, then investing in those young people and getting them set up for long-term success, jobs, employment, and so forth. And that final one is treasure. There are a number of organizations across this city. It was mentioned that I serve as the board chairman at 2X Game Changers. Obviously what you're doing and what a number of other entities are doing. If you don't have the time, if you have no talent, but you do have treasure, well then I'll wonder how you got that treasure without the talent. But there's an opportunity to give back. There's an opportunity to make your community a better place. And I think it's important for people to think of your community as beyond the very sort of small barriers around your home, right? The mother, the single mom who's just trying to make it in the Russell neighborhood is no less my sister than my next door neighbor. The young man who is terrified because of the neighborhood that he lives in, and so he has associated himself with a group of young people and he carries a gun now, is no less my brother than my neighbor on the other side. And so think about your community as not just the people in your homeowners association or the people that you go to church with or the people that you see at the gym, but it's this entire city. It's the people, especially after you cross that 9th Street divide. Brian.
One thing you're getting at right now is the youth, and we probably all saw the Courier Journal article about now high school having all these fights and this kid. What the students in the school are saying is that this kid was attacked by a gang and literally beaten in the parking lot. How do we start to address these types of things in the school system? In a manner to, make that a safe place for kids. That hopefully is more immune from the overall violent situation.
Yeah, so House Bill 3 should do a lot of that. One of the things that it did that doesn't get as much attention is it brings the school into this process earlier. Schools were kind of walled off from a lot of the non-school disciplinary processes prior to House Bill 3. They'll be informed and more up to date on those things now so that they can be an active participant. One of the things that's really important is going to be early intervention. If you take a young man, 17, 18, 19, who's been involved in 3 drive-by shootings and 1 person has died, it is very, very difficult to get that young man on a positive life course. Because even if he wakes up tomorrow and says, I'm going to turn my life around, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to do all the things I need to, I'm going to stop carrying a gun, I'm going to do all these things. The people who love the people that he hurt are not going to be particularly inclined to let him leave that lifestyle behind. And so getting to a young person who is 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and so on, who is headed on that path, maybe has 1 foot in the street, 1 foot in civil society still, has an older sibling who has been murdered or non-fatally shot, right? Getting to those young people before they get to that point is how we save a lot of these kids, right? And so getting the schools more intimately involved is part of it, getting to these kids earlier, making early interventions meaningful, right? The standard disposition of a juvenile case in this state and in every state in the country basically goes 1 of 2 ways. Somebody gets the sort of proverbial slap on the wrist, they're sent back out into the community, we hope for the best, there's no consequences, no punishment, no nothing, we hope that you do better, and then they don't do better. The other thing, the other sort of standard disposition is that we hammer that kid, and they end up in a juvenile detention center, maybe when they don't need to be there, and they end up sort of further ingrained in the lifestyle that they were only sort of tacitly involved with before. Neither one of those is ideal, but making that early intervention meaningful. One of the things that's in House Bill 3 is cognitive behavioral therapy programs, both inside and outside what will be the new Jefferson County Juvenile Detention Center. There are some really interesting things being done with CBT in Boston and Baltimore, again, specifically with young gang members, to try to get them back on a positive life course and try to deal with all those sort of like underlying attitudes and assumptions that drive an individual to do a lot of this stuff. Gary.
Jefferson County has a number of municipalities in it, J-Town, St. Matthews. Is there a level of cooperation between those municipalities and Louisville Metro, or should there be more?
Yeah, generally speaking, LMPD handles most homicide cases if they take place in J-Town or St. Matthews or things like that, unless they are sort of self-contained. What I mean by self-contained is that they're like a domestic homicide, a domestic violence homicide. That will be handled by J-Town PD or St. Matthews PD. But if there is a homicide that appears to be gang-related or have some nexus to other activity in the city, then LMPD is typically who is investigating those cases for exactly that reason. Yes, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
On January 21st, I was sitting in traffic, and a young man in the car in the left turn lane pulled a gun and pointed at me and my son in my car. I don't know what he wanted. I tried to back up. He got belligerent, and the light turned green, and the truck and trailer that was in front of me, as soon as it did, I went around his front of his car that tried to hit mine and zoomed in. Followed me into Kroger, and I'm calling 911. And I just kept driving around the parking lot because I didn't want this guy following me anywhere.
Right.
And the police came, and I told them everything, and they said, okay, you can go on and leave. And I said, well, I'm afraid to. I'm afraid he'll follow me. And he said, no, he won't. So I went on and left, but I have no idea what happened after I left, what happened to this kid, if anything at all, and what that 9mm's doing.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. I assume that they gave you a card or something like that on the scene. Nothing. Nothing. Okay.
That's what I thought.
So what I would do if I were you, I think, is there is a victim services unit within LMPD. I think if you go to the website, I think you can find their specific contact information. I would reach out to those individuals in particular. They're not uniformed officers. They're social workers who work directly with those individuals. Tell them what you just told me. You're looking for an update, that kind of stuff. You were never given any information, and they should be able to direct you as to what the status of all that is.
Because my anxiety is off the charts.
Understandably so. Yes, ma'am.
What about as far as holding parents accountable,
Yeah.
like the kids that are truant?
Yep.
I mean, because if you know, I mean, I understand if a lot of times if you let kids get away with something, they're going to do it.
Right.
But what about holding the parents accountable?
Ma'am, I did not ask you to ask this question. Everybody knows. So one of the other provisions in House Bill 3 is for the first time ever, there are parental accountability metrics for parents who basically willfully non-participate in improving their child's circumstances. So if for some reason you can't participate, you're precluded, you can't drive your kid to school because you're a paraplegic, doesn't apply to you. But if you are a willful participant in not helping your child, then there's accountability metrics. You could be brought before the court, and there's a Class A misdemeanor that could be charged if you continue to willfully not help your child improve.
But how's that helping the child?
So the process there is, and the reason that it's a Class A misdemeanor as opposed to a felony or something like that, is the goal in that circumstance is first and foremost not to put that parent in prison and hope for the best, right? There are a number of programs that are available to try to help that parent do better if they are sort of truly ignorant or don't understand, or maybe what they have is an underlying drug issue that needs to be addressed, or it's a leverage point to get that parent into treatment and then try to help them back on that right track for that child, right? The child at no point as a result of that process for the willful non-participant parent is penalized for that. So if you are a truant child and you are demonstrating no improvement, and the reason for that lack of improvement is the non-participatory parent, there's no consequence for you. If you're a truant child and mom or dad is trying their best and they're trying to help you out and you continue to show non-improvement, then there's consequences for you, right? And so what they try to do is allocate blame appropriately. If you as the child is the problem, then we have more resources available to try to get you back on the right track. If mom or dad is the problem because they're making life worse, then we now have some resources available to try to compel them to get the kid back on the right track.
So when does that implemented?
It became law this session, and so July something, I think, will be its effective date, July 1st maybe. June 29th.
Okay.
I got a question for you, Josh, and a question for John, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
They're doing a great job at Franklin, though. But Josh, one of the biggest problems we have is the current state of the county jail.
Mm-hmm.
Does the mayor have any plans to address that? It was basically a disaster when Dave Armstrong decided to go cheap and redo that old building. Is there any plans to do anything with that?
I'm not aware if there are specific plans, but I do know that is a topic of conversation. I don't know if they have put together a plan to try to deal with that, but I do know that those concerns are shared.
Maybe just ask John, though. One of the other law enforcement agencies that's so important are county sheriffs. And they're not getting, they just don't have enough resources either. And a lot of law enforcement, a lot of warrant service and the rest of that keeps things going along. That doesn't get done in Kentucky and doesn't get done in Jefferson County because they're depending on fees and the county governments don't want to pay them their fees. Your caucus looked at that, or the sheriffs might be needing, because that's certainly a very critical and overlooked area of law enforcement.
Well, like I said, the sheriff's departments are funded by the counties, and that is local government, which is state.
Well, a lot of them are by the fees that you set by law, but then the counties have to pay them.
Okay.
Like I say, I understand that the political conflict there because no one wants to.
So you're saying the fee structure should be higher?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
They can pay. I mean,
Yeah.
Obviously, the Metro Louisville does have money. It doesn't have enough policemen. It does have some money.
Yeah,
They can do pay more money fees to the sheriffs.
I'll take a look at that.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Y'all, just real quick, I want to ask what you just brought up. Listen, I deal with a lot of kids down there in the West End, poor neighborhoods, okay? Now, let me tell you, a lot of these parents, they care about their children. They want them to do right. One of my students, she called me one night about 2:30, a couple of weeks ago. And she said, he's smoking weed in my house, and he just tried to fight me. I went over to the house. When I got there, the police was there. They told her they was gonna lock her up because she kept saying he had to leave her house. So I said to the officer, would you let your son do that to your mother or to your wife? He said, no, but I don't have that problem. He said, but you can't abandon a child in the state of Kentucky. It's against the law. I said, but he's smoking weed in her house. He just tried to fight her. He said, well, we try not to criminalize teenagers, the children. I said, well, so what are you gonna do? She said, he's getting out of here. They locked her up. She said, okay, lock my house up. She tried to throw me the keys. They took the keys. They locked her up, left him in the house. There was a party that night. 2 people got shot. What I'm saying is, we need to change some laws. We have to change the condition that created the condition that we're in. We can't look at law enforcement to do it all. We can't look at the churches to do it all. We have to look at what people say it starts at home. And I'm sorry, Josh, I know you're working on something else, but people say it starts at home. No, it stopped at home. Because we can't discipline our children. Discipline doesn't necessarily mean an elbow or kick upside the head, like we got when we were young.
Yeah, exactly.
But
That's exactly
we can't even raise our voice at them without them calling it a criminal intent.
Exactly right.
So there's no accountability. The kids don't even fear coming home. I remember when I got suspended one time for watching some guys. Y'all know what the worm is. They doing the worm on the steps and the dude knocked his tooth out. I got in trouble for watching. My father was gonna kill me. They don't have that fear now. Because you can't touch me when I get home, and I'm not even going home. So they run the streets. We have an unfinished product when we look at our children. We need to get back in and re-educate. We need to get back in and reinforce. When we were in school, not saying that y'all old like me, there was vocational schools. Right now you have 2 choices. You're either going to get an academic scholarship or you're going to get a sports scholarship. What about the other ones?
Right.
There was carpentry, there was cosmetology, there was something else. We need to get back into what we know works. Instead of sitting back pointing the finger and saying, no, not me, because it is us, because it's expanding to our communities. Our kids are being influenced by the disease of inactivity and ignorance.
And socialism. They want to break down the family.
Well, but the family unit has been compromised already, and we know that. We haven't done anything about it. We talk about it, but we don't do anything about it. We need to hold ourselves accountable and fix it instead of pointing the finger at somebody else. I don't care if you're a D, I don't care if you're an R, I don't care if you're an I. If you're qualified to get in to make this thing work, let's make it work. Let's take all of the indifferences and become mankind under a creator that created mankind and saved mankind. Now, we can't say, and everybody quick to say, well, the president, they're not doing it. Yes, we teach our children. We work with them because we want them to have better and to do better. But ultimately, it's their decision. And that can't be held accountable to you all because they made the decision to go shoot up a bank. I lost 2 friends over there. The little boy that just picked up, the 3-year-old just picked up the pill, that was one of my friend's sons. Now listen, this thing is getting closer to home for all of us because everybody knows somebody that knows somebody that knows. We need to find out what it's going to take for us to make this thing work and commit to being committed to making it work. And I'm sorry, Judge.
No, you're good. I appreciate it.
And that's what I wonder about the young man that had the gun. It's like, where's the help for him? Who, you can't just pull a gun on somebody, it's like every time I have to pull up to that intersection, I'm in total panic.
Right.
And I'm panicking now because I'm hoping it's not dark outside because I don't go out at dark anymore.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that that was one of the critical components, which is that by the time we get some of these kids and they participated in a shooting or something, a carjacking, something like that, I don't want to say it's too late because you can still reach somebody in those circumstances, but it is far, far more difficult to do so than it is to keep a kid on a positive life course or take somebody who's far earlier in that experience and put them back on a positive life course.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am. And then Malcolm.
Sorry.
You're good.
I guess my input is from a different standpoint because I have a background where I had a felony before, like over 12 years ago. And I guess, you know, we're dealing with voting rights. I voted for my first time in 2020 because of Brashear's, you know, where he allowed people to vote. There's like 180,000. Yeah, I'm really nervous. Sorry if my talking is really bad. I'm not good at public speaking. But I'm one of those people. And so I guess my main point is, you know, people don't do great things. And I'm from a rural area, so I haven't dealt with violent crime like what you are talking about. But how do we reintegrate people? Or, you know, voting was awesome for me and my daughters. And it was life-changing. So, you know, do you have any input on reintegrating people or just how voting, like restoration? It was a short session, so it didn't get like put on there because the constitutional amendment takes a little longer. And I'm learning the political system. So do you have any input on that?
Yeah, so the criminal justice system functions best when it has two distinct but interrelated North Stars. The first one of those is accountability. Second one of those is redemption. Holding people accountable for what they've done, spit them back better than they came in, right? And set people up for success so that they can reintegrate, right? We talk about reentry all the time. I do a lot of reentry related work. What we really want is people to reintegrate into civil society. We want people to come back better. We want people to come back more involved in their community. We want people working jobs. We want people involved with civic responsibilities, voting in their government, those kinds of things. For a long time, we have done a tremendous amount in the reentry space and had absolutely no idea if it's making a difference. There was an analysis done by the NIJ a couple of years ago of reentry programs across the country. What it found was two things. One, we don't know if many of these things are working. And two, of the ones we've evaluated, most of them don't make a difference. But there's a bright spot because there are some that do. And so what we have to do is reevaluate or evaluate for the first time those programs here in the Commonwealth or in any other state that's relevant, find out what works and double down on what works. Because people can come back better than they went in. And one of the mistakes I think people make is we try to have people re-enter from prison as if prison is the full extent of the experience, right? Well, what brought that person to prison in the first place? Because that's what needs to be addressed. Obviously, the prison experience itself is something that you're literally re-entering from. But examining what the underlying attitudes, values, perception of self, and so on were that got you to that place in the first place. And that's one of the things that is so powerful about the cognitive behavioral therapy work is it helps people to rewire those thinking processes, helps people to re-enter in a way that they're set up for success. And what we've gotten really good at over the years is teaching people how to do things or credentialing people, and I'm for all of that, right? It's great if you can get an education while you're in prison. It's great if you can get a credential to do something when you get out when you're in prison. But if you don't know how to resolve disputes without resorting to violence when you get out, you're not going to stay in that job very long. If you don't know how to pass a drug test, like if you don't know how to stay sober and pass a drug test, you're not going to stay in that job very long. If you don't know how to get up on time and make sure you're at work, you're not going to stay in that job very long. But we know how to improve those things for people. And so if we can do that, then regardless of what the circumstances are that a person comes from, then we can set them up for success in the long
And I've
term.
been in a situation where, like, I was very limited in my abilities. Like, I actually got declined from beauty school in Kentucky because of my felony. And they're like, oh, you can go to school, but we can't guarantee you get your license so you can do something beyond what you're doing. And then getting to go to school, I got my bachelor's and master's in social work. and I was very limited in helping people. So I think just even reintegrating, helping people on a different level, or I was like, I want to help people, but I'm very limited. And so it's been hard.
So this changed during the Bettman administration, but it used to be that there were specific trainings that you could get while incarcerated for licenses that you would be ineligible for when you got out.
I would like to help people like that.
So like, we could train you to be a barber, but you're precluded from getting a barber's license. That was ridiculous. It's not the case anymore. And so fixing things like that again so that people can be successful. Malcolm, and then
Yeah, Josh, I was wondering, because I think you would probably generally agree policing's most effective the more local you can make it.
Sure.
And other than funding, obviously, what is to keep neighborhoods west of 9th Street, like Shawnee, like Iroquois, like Shively, to set up? Could we recruit people from these communities to be a law enforcement, similar to like what we have in J-Town and all these communities in the East End?
So you're saying specifically like recruiting people from those neighborhoods to be LMPD officers, or are you saying
to
like
be like
Shively police department?
Yeah, creating, and maybe there's city funding and other things, because I think funding would obviously be a huge issue, but.
Yeah, so there's sort of like a tipping point there, right?
Yeah.
Like if you get too local, then you're not going to be well resourced enough, and you've actually created a worse situation. Whereas if you got too large, then you're too far removed from the specific problems, right? I think in a lot of ways, LMPD structurally makes a lot of sense. They actually do a pretty good job of recruiting people to either come from the neighborhoods that are policed or to live in the neighborhoods that are policed. We can obviously always do a better job of that. There are some specific things as it relates to policing that ought to be addressed. Group violence intervention obviously being one of them. The other one that I talk about a lot is there's sort of an industry best practice for how many cases a homicide detective should be investigating at a particular time, what their caseload should look like. Most cities are at 2 to 3 times that best practice right now, because what has happened all over the country is that homicides increased, but we didn't plus up the size of our homicide units. And so you just have the same number of cops handling more cases. That leads to lower clearance rates, those kinds of things. And so when you're talking about police funding and you're talking about allocating that funding in a way that can be most effective, making sure that your homicide unit looks the way that it needs to is one of the best ways to spend those dollars.
When's the last time we grew our homicide unit?
So what recently happened under Chief Shields was, rather than grow the homicide unit, what they did is they put non-fatal shooting investigations back into the individual divisions. And so that lowered caseloads because we were having homicide detectives investigate non-fatal shootings. They took those cases away and put them back into the divisions, and that has helped augment that some, but we still could use more detectives.
Awesome. Probably time for one more.
Yep.
I wanted to ask about the ability for teachers to correct and dismiss badly behaved children.
Yeah.
Is that bill that is being proposed, will that protect the teacher and give the teacher more authority?
Yeah, so that bill has been passed and is going to become law on June 29th. But there is, I don't know if anything has been done. There's certainly nothing in that bill that deals with teacher discipline. I don't know if there was anything.
It threatens a teacher, hurts a teacher, they're expelled for 12 months.
Okay.
That's last year.
Okay, so there's expulsion if a student assaults or harms a teacher.
Or threatens.
Or threatens. But I don't know if there's been anything more that's done on that specific teacher disciplinary question. I don't know the answer to that.
I guess what I was saying is, if you remember in the fall, there was a student who came to school in northern Kentucky with a list of people he wanted to harm.
Mm-hmm.
And it was on, they talked about it on Fox News also. The parents were just devastated, but they couldn't do anything with this particular individual because of he had the right to be educated.
Well, they'll get you 12 months now.
Yeah, so that is, it sounds like changed.
That has changed?
Yeah.
Good.
But what's that kid gonna do in those 12 months?
Go to reform school, basically. It's they call it alternative school, but it's school with lots of doors.
Yeah.
I was going to say, on maybe a higher note, one of the great things about being a Republican is we believe in the private sector and business. And if you haven't in the last little while, go down and visit a business or a restaurant in the West End or in a neighborhood that you don't normally go to. There are a lot of good people down there. They're making a living, And it means the world when people who are not from that neighborhood come and support them. Because they candidly don't see a lot of people that aren't from that neighborhood. And as those dollars circulate and those businesses get supported, good things happen. So you talk about carrot and stick.
Yeah.
I think that's one thing that we can do to support those folks who are trying to do the right thing, is support their businesses.
Yeah, I go to a barber shop in the West End. I box at a gym in the West End. It took a while for me to convince them that I wasn't a cop, but once I did, it's some of my
You can't wear it, you see you with sunglasses.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Josh, thank you so much for this. This is and you know, we've spared no expense with our gift for you. And that, of course, is Jefferson County Republican Party. Yeah.
We're very selective about who's getting
We really, as a community, are blessed to have Josh here because he's got a unique background, as well as what you currently do in your day job and the other things that you're involved with. We appreciate it because, you know, the party will try to move forward in ways that are impactful. Justin, I really appreciate the comment about getting into the West End, getting out there, supporting some of the businesses in the West End. Public safety is our number one item. It is our number one item as a party. It has to be, because frankly, it needs to be the number one item in the city. And I'm actually pleased to hear that you gave us some positive reinforcement of some of the things that Mayor Greenberg is doing. Regardless of party, we all want what is best for this city.
That's right.
And I'm going to cheer when I hear that there are good things that are helping our community. It is not about politics. But with that said, I do think that there's a role and a couple of things that I wanted to share with you that are opportunities. On June 17th, as an example, we had Sir Friendly C and some of the other leaders. Grandmaster was there. On June 17th, the day before Father's Day, we talked about the importance of the role of father. The King Solomon Baptist Church are supporting an event with Sir Friendly C. And I've committed it to the Republican Party, the Jefferson County Republican Party, will have 100 people on the corner of 34th and Broadway to march, to walk with the different folks that are going to be participating there. We really do want to get out into the community. God gave us 2 of these and 1 of these and 2 of these. And if we listen and we watch and reserve sometimes the judgments that come out of our mouths, I think we can do a better job as individuals. And again, there is a role for the party to play in that. So thank you again for your leadership and what you continue to do. And remember, June 17th, as soon as we have the details on that, we're going to get the information out to all of you. And we do hope that we have at least 100 people. We'll actually provide Jefferson County Republican Party t-shirts for everybody. And then we'll walk. Isn't that a bonus? I mean, boy, you're talking about an incentive. John, we're going to have to get a triple XL for the big guy. I know that. And let me just comment on one other thing, because it's coming Tuesday, and as you mentioned, there were a number of things that happened legislatively. What we're doing on Tuesday is we're having an event. It's going to be at Kalen's. I guess it's called 8020, which is the second floor of Kalen's. And so in addition to, of course, Representative John Hodgson, we're going to have Senator Julie Racky Adams, Senator Lindsay Titchener, Senator Matt Deneen, Representative Jason Nemes, Representative Ken Fleming, and Representative Jared Bowen to join and talk, have a panel discussion about the things that were done in this legislative session. And again, as was mentioned, there were some good things that came out of it. There were 1 or 2 things that got all the attention. We don't need to go there, but there were some really good things that happened. So it's from 6 to 7:30. We will serve light refreshments and appetizers, and more can be available. But it's $75 per ticket. We do need to make sure that we cover our costs on that. But the important thing is that we wanted to get the people that did a lot of good work over the last couple of months to share with us some of the key things that were done, and also answer questions. Help us understand, okay, what comes next? So that's on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday. And as I mentioned also on June 17th, keep your eyes and ears peeled because we really want to make sure that we've got a strong showing, support the community, be there, support fatherhood. That's the whole theme there. The fathers play an important role, and we heard about it this evening in so many different ways, as do mothers, of course. But that'll be the day before Father's Day. We're going to have a lot of Republicans there proudly supporting the effort. So I want to thank all of you again for your time this evening. I'll encourage you, by the way, we bought extra snacks, so if you want to take a few with you on the road, that means that Malcolm and I won't be getting too fat and eat them all. But thank you again. We appreciate your time and your consideration for things that we need to do together to help our community. Thanks again.